Well, good afternoon, everyone. It's good to see y'all. Glad you're here. I want to welcome you to the Pastor's Bible Study today. And we are in Matthew 5, 6, and 7. That's where we were last week. That's where we were the week before when Kurt taught the Beatitudes. So it looks to me like we're going to be in Matthew 5, 6, and 7 for a little while. But I think it's important for us to truly get the context of the Sermon on the Mount. Talked about it last week, and I want to just spend a little more time making sure we have an idea what's happening here when Jesus shares these teachings with his followers. I think there's an outline for you. You can get that. Those of you that are online, I want to welcome you today as well. So as I've been studying Matthew, you know, this whole year at our church, Matthew's kind of undergirding what we're doing, and we're going to pretty much spend the entire year in here on Wednesdays in Matthew. It's going to take us a while. It's a long gospel, 28 pages, and there's just so much there for us. And but as I've studied Matthew's gospel, there's a lot of really good commentaries on Matthew, and a lot of ink has been spilled by theologians and New Testament scholars writing about Matthew. You know, there are three commentaries that I've just enjoyed. One of them is new to me. One of them I've had pretty much my entire preaching life, and that's Herschel Hobbs as an exposition of the Gospel of Matthew. Dr. Hobbs was pastor of First Baptist in Oklahoma City for many, many years, if y'all remember him. He and W.A. Criswell drove the getaway car in both of each other's weddings. So they're longtime best friends. If y'all remember Dr. Criswell, he and Dr. Hobbs were best friends. And he just was a true pastor theologian. And his commentary on Matthew is just an excellent one. Michael Wilkins has written the NIV application commentary, and it's actually very good also. And then Jonathan Pennington, the Sermon on the Mount and Human Flourishing. I know you would be shocked that I'm connected to that one. But he's a scholar at Southern Seminary, and I just really appreciate his take on particularly the Sermon on the Mount, really the whole book of Matthew. His doctoral dissertation was on Matthew, and he's just a Matthean scholar, as he's referred to. He teaches the entire New Testament, but he's a gospel expert. So those three men in particular have had a lot to do with my views on Matthew in general, the Sermon on the Mount in particular. So let's do the Sermon on the Mount 2.0. I introduced it last week. I want to continue a little more introduction today. The Sermon on the Mount has an interesting interpretive history because there have been numerous theologians through the years who have had different views on how to understand the Sermon on the Mount. So I've given you the kind of the four different perspectives on the Sermon on the Mount, and then I'll share with you what mine is. But one of the views of the Sermon on the Mount is that it is how to gain entry into the kingdom of heaven. And I would tell you that I believe that is a faulty view of this sermon, but yet there are those who believe that. They believe this is what you're supposed to do if you want to receive the gift of the kingdom of heaven in your life. It's a gift that you actually earn, if you will, through your ethic. So it's kind of a work-based approach to the Sermon on the Mount. Martin Luther, on the second one, Martin Luther said one of the challenges with the Sermon on the Mount is there's no way that it could possibly be the pathway into the kingdom of heaven because nobody can do it. He said it's just an ideal that's just beyond us. And even though he didn't necessarily say that it didn't have application to Christians, he just felt like we needed to acknowledge that it is far beyond us in terms of being able to live it out. It's just an ideal that Jesus set forth, and there's just no way you can do it. The third one is an interesting one, and it's a very common one, and I'll be honest with you, it's the one that I was taught growing up. There's two different forms of it, that it is life in the age to come. One of the versions was taught by Albert Schweitzer. Schweitzer was a little more of a left-leaning theologian. Schweitzer said that the disciples thought the kingdom of God was immediately coming. It was being established by Jesus, and life in the kingdom was about to take place. That didn't happen. Jesus didn't return. The kingdom of God wasn't really established. And so this material is for the life that is to come, another age in front of us, kind of the fulfillment of the Messianic age. The church I grew up in didn't teach that. I can promise you Albert Schweitzer was never quoted in the pulpit of the church I grew up in. But there was another man, though, who was quoted quite often in the church I grew up in. He was a lawyer who ended up getting very much involved in theology, and his name was C.I. Scofield. And Scofield published study Bibles. Maybe some of y'all have seen the Scofield Study Bible. He had huge influence on a movement known as dispensationalism. Kind of took root in the South. It found a home here, to be honest with you, because the seminary that was established here in Dallas got really connected to that particular movement. So Dallas Theological Seminary historically was connected with Scofield's movement. And Scofield taught that God worked He worked in different ways through various dispensations of time. And so the name dispensationalism was attached to it. And this material is for the age to come, and it's when Israel is restored as the people of God in that era in which Christ is going to rule. And so that idea that the Sermon on the Mount is for the kingdom age is the idea that it's an age that is to come, primarily going to be fulfilled through Israel when Jesus raptures the church out, and then Israel once again emerges as the people of God. And then the other view is somewhat connected to some versions of Roman Catholicism. Primarily Thomas Aquinas, he at least leaned in this direction. Aquinas taught there were two different levels of Christianity. There was kind of the normal average level, and then there was the kind of the elite level. And the Sermon on the Mount was not for the normal, average, everyday Christian, because they just couldn't do this. But there are elite Christians. There are, and he said it, he didn't say it disparagingly. It was just more of a reality that people are just living their lives, paying mortgages, raising kids, trying to do life. And then there are some of us who've given our whole lives to this. Now, we're the ones that can actually aspire to this and be examples for the regular, ordinary Christians. But it's really just a message from Jesus for those who choose to live in that elite category. I think there's a little bit to consider in every one of those. There's at least something to think about. I think they're all wrong. So I just wanted to put them in there for you. I don't think any of them are actually, they're not robust enough in my opinion, and I think they're faulty in their perspective, if I can say that politely to those who would espouse any of them. I would say, as I put in your outline, the Sermon on the Mount should be viewed as a description of life in the kingdom of heaven in any age. Once Jesus gave it, this is how he would describe life in his kingdom. And it's the result of a transformed life. It's the evidence, this kind of life that's described in the Sermon on the Mount is an evidence, if you will, of the work of Christ in us. So to put it in a phrase that would capture where we are right now as a church, I would say that next line, the Sermon on the Mount, can be understood as the explanation of what it means to flourish as a follower of Jesus. And I think this is a description, if you will, of a flourishing life. It's a little bit challenging because when you look at it, part of it feels like non-flourishing, you know. So, for example, if you just have your Bibles open, look at Matthew 5, you look at some of the ways that Jesus constructs the opening of the sermon, and he uses phrases like those that are mourn, those that will be persecuted, those that are poor in spirit. Those all feel like non-flourishing. But if you have a correct understanding of what Jesus is teaching, and you have a correct understanding of what the transformed life is all about, you come to an understanding that flourishing doesn't mean that everything in your life just is so it's such a good level from an outside or earthly perspective. It all adds up to flourishing. Jesus is teaching us flourishing is much deeper than that. It's much richer than that, and we've got to allow him to show us what a flourishing life looks like. Now, there's two different groups of people, evidently, that are listening to this sermon. It's kind of fascinating. So if you look at chapter 5, verse 1, it says, when Jesus saw the crowds, he went up on a mountainside and sat down. His disciples came to him, and he began to teach them. Now, if you'll go to the end of the sermon, okay, And you get to Matthew 7:28, when Jesus had finished saying these things. Remember, that's the end of every one of the sermons in Matthew. The crowds were amazed at his teaching. So evidently the disciples came close to him, and he starts teaching them, the disciples. But the crowd is still there. They must have come up and gathered around. So you really have two different things going on, I guess, the way I would look at it. And I mean, since I'm the one teaching, I guess I'm the one telling us how I'm looking at it. So I think that one way to put it, Wilkins in his commentary says you can maybe look at it like this. I think I agree with this. On the one hand, there's instruction. On the other hand, there's invitation. And so on the instruction side, Jesus is teaching his disciples. And so what I would say to me and you is, let's pull ourselves into that number so we're all going to draw up close to Jesus. We're not the crowd. Okay, if you're a follower of Jesus, you're not the crowd. You're one of the disciples. Okay? Now those who might just be listening in, they're in the crowd. So those of us who are pulled in close, we're being instructed. Those of us who are out on the peripheral listening, they're being invited. So it really has two different applications. You could take the Sermon on the Mount and say, well, here's an invitation to live this kind of life, if you choose to. To those of us that have already been saved, here's the instruction on how we're supposed to live this life. Does that make sense? And I think the aim of the sermon is primarily instructional. It can be used as an invitational set of teachings, but it's primarily instructional. And in the midst of this sermon, he's going to be rebuking the Pharisees, their misunderstanding of what life is supposed to be like in the kingdom of God. And he's going to set forth what Jesus will consider to be realistic expectations of redeemed people. And so when you and I read the Sermon on the Mount, we can't dismiss it and say, man, that'd be great if I could do that. That's just not good enough. When we read the Sermon on the Mount, it should be instructional, convicting, and guiding. And so we receive it as instruction from Jesus on how we're supposed to be living as his people, okay? So with that said, let's just put some things in place so that we can better understand it. Most of these commentaries, when they talk about the Sermon on the Mount, they invite you to some considerations before you actually start studying the Sermon on the Mount. And so that's what I want to do today. I promise you we're going to actually read it and study it, okay? But I want to give you the overview. There are two major considerations for understanding the Sermon on the Mount. And it has to do with two Greek words. And I don't want to bore you with Greek vocabulary, but I think it's important for you, if you really want to understand what Jesus is teaching, I think it's important to at least have some working knowledge of these two concepts. One of them is the Greek word makarios. You see that in your outline? It's the idea of blessing, happiness, flourishing. It's crucial to understanding the teachings of Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount. The other one is the Greek word or the concept of teleos. Teleos is the idea of perfection, wholeness. So when you look at the Sermon on the Mount and you listen to the teachings of Jesus, there are two very profound things at work side by side. One of them is the whole idea of makarios. So if you look at Matthew 5, verse 3, where the NIV says, blessed or blessed are the poor in spirit, that's the word makarios. Now, in the Beatitudes, it's in the plural, okay? And so, in matter of fact, the Beatitudes are spoken in plurality. It's a little bit hard sometimes, the NIV, the translators just made the decision to not always distinguish the singular and the plural. It's a little hard for us to do in English because you and I in English, we can use the word you, and it can be singular or plural, right? Whereas in Greek, there's a pretty significant distinction between singularity, and plurality. Doesn't always come out in the NIV translations. There is a translation there's a couple of translations that help you with it. Brian Sepulveda texted me the other day and asked me if I'd seen the Southern translation of the Bible, and I have. It always translates the plurals with y'all, which I think is a really good translation, to be honest with you. But the way some of the older translations do it is they use the word thy and thine, that's singular. And if you see the word you, it's plural. You know, the old King James does that. So in the old King, you might wonder why does the King James use thy and thine? Well, it does that because the translator is letting you know that's the singular. If you see the word you, that's the plural. So you don't always catch that in our more modern translations. But nevertheless, Makarios is the word that's used there in these Beatitudes. Now, the Latin word is beatus. That's why we get the word beatitude from. And then the word teleos, if you look at Matthew 5, verse 48, Jesus says, be perfect. Y'all see that? That's the Greek word teleos. It's at the heart of the sermon. It's kind of at the end of these admonitions from the Torah, okay, that are found in chapter 5. So this concept of blessed and perfect, if you will, those are two powerful concepts in the Sermon on the Mount. So let's do the first one, Makarios. Here's the challenge with that word, Makarios. It's just really hard to find an English word that captures it. And that's why there's so many different translations of it. That's why there's so much debate about it. You know, what do you do with that word? What does it actually mean? So what most translators have done is they've chosen to just use a King James word that's just found in multiple translations now, and it's just the word blessed. And so sometimes we pronounce it blessed, okay? Well, the challenge with that is that's a good translation, but the challenge to that is we don't always understand what that means. What does it mean to be blessed? Okay? And so there's two different ways to view blessed or blessing. One of them is a divine favor. God has blessed you. You've been blessed by God. The other one is a way of being in the world. Do this and you'll have a blessed life. Does that make sense? One of them is a state of being. One of them is the hand of God has blessed you. Now, in the Bible, they're connected, but they're also very different. So when you translate Makarios with the word blessed, which one are you talking about? Are you talking about God has blessed you? Are you talking about a state of being you're enjoying because of how you've chosen to live? Does that make sense? So are y'all still with me? Okay, so what we got to do is we got to go back and dig a little bit, try to figure this out, which is actually a really good thing to do. It's good for you. So if you go back to the Old Testament, because here's what's helpful. The Old Testament was written in Hebrew, but it was translated into Greek. So we have the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Hebrew Old Testament. So we can at least look and see how did the Jewish scholars translate these words into Greek to kind of help us understand a little bit more. One of the problems you have is Makarios is such a pregnant word, it can be used to translate a lot of Hebrew words. But there's two core words in the Hebrew Old Testament for bless. There's the word barakah and the word ashrei. Now, barakah is used many times in the Old Testament, over 400 times. It primarily refers to the blessing of God. God has blessed you. God has blessed Israel. God has blessed humanity. That is the blessing of God. There's a different word in Hebrew, ashrei. Now, the reason that word is very important to me and you is because that's the word that's used in Psalm 1. Ashrei. What does ashrei mean? Ashrei is a state of being. It's an abstract noun in Hebrew that's always used in what in Hebrew grammar is called constructive intensive. What that means is it's followed with a description. Blessed is the one who does so and so. So if you and I were to go back right now and read Psalm 1 or Psalm 2, you'll find ashrei. Blessed is the one who does not walk in the counsel of the ungodly. That's not barakah. That's not the blessing of God. That's a person who has a state of being known as blessed because of the way they're living. So the argument that I would make is that when you're reading the Beatitudes and you come across that word blessed, you need to think to yourself, not primarily this is God blessing. This is a person's state of being who's chosen to live a certain way. They're connected to God. So the blessing is connected to the covenantal life experience and relationship with God. So you could translate it happy, or fortunate, or flourishing. There There's one Australian translation that translates it like this: good on ya. Good on ya. In other words, this is good. This is a sign of flourishing. This is a sign of being fortunate. This is a sign that your life is in sync. You're doing what God's asked you to do. The word makarios is used in so many ways in the New Testament. It's used 50 times in the New Testament, 13 times in Matthew. The word ashrei in the Old Testament is not used as much as barakah. It's limited. It's primarily used in the Psalms and the Proverbs. But the point is, when you see the word ashrei in Hebrew, it's almost always translated in English with blessed. And so what I would encourage us to do, the good news is there are some good resources that help with this kind of thing. I'm always a little cautious to tell you to consult online, because what I have learned is anybody can publish something online. Okay, so you want to be nervous about that. I would tell you, I'm happy to visit with you to give you some resources that you can trust that will help distinguish these things for you, because I think it's important. So when Matthew's describing the blessed life, Matthew 5, he's talking about the life that you've chosen to live as a state of being. And it's connected to what Jesus has commanded you to do, okay? And so that's why I believe you can use the word happy. Remember, I'm trying to redeem and rescue the word happy. We've talked about that. Because our understanding of happy is too flippant. It's too flimsy. The Hebrew and Greek understanding of happy is very robust. It's connected to the life God's designed for us. And it doesn't mean everything that adds up like we want it to. It means you've got a state of being in the presence of God because of your relationship with God. Then there's the Greek word teleos, okay? And that's the idea of wholeness. I like the word wholeness maybe better than perfection. And so if you want to connect it to a Hebrew word in the Old Testament, it's shalom. That's what teleos is. God is shalom. God is at peace. God's complete. God's whole. God's holy. God, everything about God is connected, if you will. And so he experiences a state of being that's perfect, obviously. But for us, be perfect, be whole, be complete, be virtuous, be holy, be true. I would say these two go together. The blessed person is a holistic person. Does that make sense? A holistic person is a blessed person. They fit together. So teleos and makarios kind of guide us through our study of the Sermon on the Mount. And we're going to come back, and as we make our way through it, we're going to look at both of them. All right? Okay, so let's run through the rest of these real quickly. There are some others to give consideration to. Because, just read through the Sermon on the Mount as y'all are getting ready for our time together even next week. Okay? Here are some other things to think about. You're going to run across these words in the Sermon on the Mount. Righteousness. What is righteousness in the Sermon on the Mount? Well, you find it at least 6 times. Here's what some people think when they think of righteousness. They think of imputed righteousness. In other words, God declares you innocent because you've been saved, you're righteous. Another view of righteousness is the right kind of behavior. That's the Sermon on the Mount. The Sermon on the Mount, when the word righteousness is used, it's not referring to our imputed righteousness, I don't believe, that we receive at salvation. It's referring to doing the right things. It's the ethical demands of wholeness. It's the reality of God's work in your life being lived out through you and in you. So it's what you're doing. You're engaged in just behavior. And your righteousness, Jesus says, is going to have to be better than the Pharisees. Okay, so we're going to talk about that. Then there's the word heart. There's at least 3 references to the word heart in the sermon. Well, the word heart is found so many times in the New Testament, 150 times. It just captures this inner essence of just who we are as a person. Jesus will say, show me where your treasure is, and I'll show you where your heart is. It's that whatever it is, it's captivated the inner you. That's your heart. And the Sermon on the Mount is aimed at that. Remember, Jesus is going to say, some people... You've heard this, it's been taught, it's in the 10 Commandments, you can't commit adultery. However, what I'm going to tell you is if you lust in your heart, in other words, if you pour all your affections, if you will, in such a way that you objectify other people so that the only reason they exist is to satisfy you, well, that shows me your heart is out of sync with who you're supposed to be. See, the gospel is about your heart. Your heart eventually, once it's changed, it's going to lead to changed behavior. Okay? The opposite doesn't always happen. Changed behavior doesn't always result in a changed heart. So, Gentiles. Now that word is found many times in the New Testament. The Greek word is ethnos. We get our word ethnicity from it. Typically speaking, when you hear the word Gentile, or that refers to someone who's not a Jew ethnically. Matthew's going to use that word a little differently. Sometimes it's going to be translated in your NIV translation, if that's the one you use, as pagan. It's the same word. But Matthew is already living after the church has been established and the new covenant is in place. Matthew's going to use the word Gentile to refer to people who are not a part of the new covenant. It's no longer an ethnic word for Matthew. It's a theological word for Matthew. So you can be a Jew and a Gentile at the same time. Do you hear what I mean? In other words, you can be someone who rejects Jesus. And if you reject Jesus from a theological perspective, you're outside the covenantal family of God. You can be a Gentile and a member of the house of Israel at the same time, because Matthew is going to view the covenantal people of faith as the new community. And so the pagans are those who are outside the relationship with Christ. Then you'll have another phrase in Matthew, and that's Father, Father in heaven. There's 17 references at least to God being the Father in heaven. The point is, Matthew is communicating Jesus' teaching to us that our life as Christians is highly relational. And so our God, who is our God, and He's the Creator God, He's the only God there is, but He's our Father in heaven. And that's how Jesus will refer to Him. And so it creates that familial relational dynamic that God has designed for us. And I think some of us maybe take that for granted. That was a powerful revelation for the Jews to understand that that's the relational component of their life with the Lord was very familial. And that's how Jesus will demonstrate it. And, Jesus will refer to God as His Father. Then the kingdom of heaven. Matthew is a thoroughgoing Jew writing to a Jewish audience. He's trying to help the people of Israel understand Jesus is their Messiah. He knows they are very loath to use the name of God. It makes them anxious. They're afraid they're going to profane it. They're afraid they're going to blaspheme the name of God. So even in the writing sometimes, you'll find if they're writing God's name, they'll leave letters out so they don't spell the whole name. Just don't profane the name of God. Just be careful. So rather than referring to it as the kingdom of God, Matthew's going to almost every time call it the kingdom of heaven. That way he just gets past that. But it's the same thing in the Gospels. Kingdom of God and kingdom of heaven are the same thing. Okay? It's this reality of God's kingdom that He is establishing now on this earth. And Jesus is going to encourage His followers to receive the kingdom of heaven, to live in the kingdom of heaven, to understand the kingdom of heaven, because it is His kingdom He's planted on this earth. It's important to Him. As a matter of fact, if you go back to Matthew 4, He goes around Matthew 4, verse 23, preaching the good news of the kingdom. Then if you look at the Beatitudes, they have this inclusive nature. Verse 3, blessed are the poor in spirit, theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Get to the last beatitude, verse 10, blessed are those who are persecuted, theirs is the kingdom of heaven. So the kingdom of heaven is very much a part of the teaching of Jesus. He had to spend a lot of time on that because the disciples understood kingdom, they just didn't understand kingdom of heaven. Okay? You and I don't use that word very much, the word kingdom, as Americans. It's not really in our parlance. Maybe if we were British, it'd be a little bit easier because we use that word kingdom, United Kingdom. It's more in your vocabulary. But Jesus is letting them know He's establishing something real on this earth, and it's God's kingdom. And then you'll come across hypocrites in the church. They're everywhere. No, I mean in the Sermon on the Mount. Sorry. The Sermon on the Mount. Here's what's fascinating about hypocrisy in the Sermon on the Mount. When you and I think of hypocrites, we normally think of people who say one thing and do another. In other words, they profess to be holy and righteous, but you really know they're not. What was going on in the first century with the Jews was it was different. The Pharisees were doing all the right things. They just didn't have the heart for it. Yeah, it was not the right reason. In other words, they had the outward manifestation. I mean, they were maintaining the laws, sacrifices, keeping the Sabbath, tithing. I mean, they were doing everything they were supposed to do, but they were empty on the inside. So hypocrisy for Jesus was something different than what you and I normally see it as. It had a little different reality to it. And that's why Jesus will say sometimes in the Gospels to the Pharisees, you're like a whitewashed tomb. In other words, I look at it and it looks really good on the outside, it's dead on the inside. So remember what teleos, wholeness, means, that there's a transformation that's happening on the inside, it gets connected on the outside, and when that happens, you're blessed. So he's going to condemn hypocrisy. He wants us to have this inner reality of purity and the outward manifestation. Our actions should reflect our transformation. They shouldn't be separated. So teleos, wholeness, means you've got the inner transformation, and the reality of it is seen in your outward manifestation and how you're actually living. James will say a little bit about that later. Remember, James will say you have faith, but I don't see it. I'm going to show you mine. James wasn't saying that you work your way into heaven. James was saying, I'm going to heaven, and I'm going to show you how I know I'm going to heaven, and you're going to be able to realize I'm a heaven-bound person because of the way I'm living my life. James was arguing for teleos. He's arguing for wholeness, if you will. Jesus is going to argue for the same thing in the Sermon on the Mount. And then there's this whole concept of treasure and reward in the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus has a lot to say about it. He talks about the reward that you're going to receive in heaven, the kind of reward that might not necessarily be connected to what we think of as a reward. You know, because, for example, look at chapter 5, verse 12. As I said, Kurt taught on the Beatitudes a while back here. Rejoice and be glad because great is your reward in heaven. He's talking about people that are being persecuted on earth. Well, in other words, Matthew is recording the teaching of Jesus to challenge us to look beyond what we normally think of as reward and blessing on this earth. He's challenging us to live a different kind of life. Our treasure is something that's valuable to us. 7 times in Matthew's gospel he refers to it. This idea of blessing being connected to our treasure and our reward. So here's what I'd say kind of in conclusion. When I think about the Sermon on the Mount, it is the message from the King. It's delivered with kingly authority, and it's about true life in his kingdom. That's really what's going on. So when you get to the end of the sermon, verse 28, when Jesus finished saying these things of Matthew 7, the people were amazed. Because this wasn't just a recapitulation of what Pharisees and rabbis had taught in the past. That's not what this was. This wasn't just a regurgitation of, you've heard it said, here's what that means. This is revelatory. Jesus is saying, this is how it is now. And he said it boldly and profoundly. And some of these folks knew who he was. And it was challenging to them because he had not been to their rabbinical schools. That's not who Jesus was. He had not followed some famous rabbi around. You know, Paul the apostle was going to go study with Gamaliel. In other words, he was going to go to Harvard, if you will, in his day. That's what that was viewed as. This was a huge thing to go study under the greatest teachers alive. Jesus didn't do that. Jesus is just emerging out of a carpenter's shop in Nazareth. Okay? Nazareth was associated with Gentiles because the people that lived and worked in Nazareth had to ply their wares in the Gentile areas of Israel. As you've heard that saying, can anything good come out of Nazareth? The Jews looked at it and said it's polluted. There's way too much connection with Gentiles up there. God's not going to send a prophet out of Nazareth. That's not going to happen. And he's certainly not going to send an uneducated one. And yet here's Jesus standing here teaching these people. He's reinterpreting, if you will, the covenant and helping them to understand a new covenant's now being established. It's going to be lived out in the kingdom, and he's the king. And he's teaching with authority, and the people were amazed. They've just never heard anybody talk like this. And guess what they're going to do? They're going to flock to him. That's what's going to happen. They're just going to flock to him. And so I told the staff yesterday morning, when you're reading Matthew's gospel, you get to a certain point. All of a sudden, Matthew tells us Jesus has to leave Galilee. He has to withdraw from Galilee because the crowds were too big. This thing was getting out of hand. There were fanatical followers all of a sudden. This was going to stimulate the hand of Rome. Herod Antipas was in power in those days. That's Herod's son. And he had already killed John the Baptist, and now he's hearing about Jesus. And he's asking about Jesus. Matthew 14, he says, is this John the Baptist come back from the dead? Thought I killed him. In other words, something's going on. So Jesus, people are actually buying into this. They're drawn to him. they follow him everywhere he goes, and next thing you know, he's going to have to start withdrawing. He's going to head north, he's going to head west, he's eventually going to head south and come all the way down to Judea, and finally, after about a year, he's going to find his way. Once he starts withdrawing, it'll take about a year, he'll end up in Jerusalem. So this message, some people think, well, why didn't anybody listen to Jesus? Actually, they did, y'all. They did. They were everywhere he went. People came to him. And so much so that he eventually had to leave that part of the country so that he could actually ultimately accomplish his mission. So powerful teaching, and it's meant for us, and it's good news in any age. So we're going to start studying actually the Sermon on the Mount. We'll start after the Beatitudes next week, okay? All right, I'm going to stop right there. Those of you that are online, thank you. We'll see you next week, okay?